Sharon Strange-Lewis, Director of Alumni Relations for Howard University. Today is the first of a series of webinars designed to tackle topics that impact the African American community. The Office of Alumni Relations has designed a series of webinars that we hope will help you get through the current situation that's happening in our country. Today's topic is a talk on police and protests. We have three of Howard's best thought leaderships in this space to address the issue. We are also fortunate to have Daniel Holly Walker, Dean of the Law School, moderate today's roundtable. Dean Holly Walker, take it away.
Thank you so much, Sharon. I want to thank Sharon Strange-Lewis and the Department of Alumni Relations for putting together this panel. It is wonderful to see so many alumni join us on this Friday afternoon. It is my honor to be here this afternoon with two of the outstanding scholars of the Howard faculty, and you both, everyone on the call probably knows both of these scholars very well, but I just want to thank Dr. Greg Carr for being here with us and Professor Justin Hansford for being here. And this is going to be just a really wide-ranging conversation between the three of us. As everyone on the call knows, George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis, Minnesota on Memorial Day. And since that time, there have been widespread protests in all 50 states, in his memory, in the memory of Ahmaud Arbery, and in the memory of Breonna Taylor, and so many more. As many of you know, every year, 1,000 people are killed by the police in shootings, and we actually don't have a database that shows how many people are killed by the police each year, but we know it's a minimum of 1,000 people who are killed in police shootings every year. And so this is a problem that has obviously existed, some people would say going back 400 years, that we are still dealing with. And a lot of people, I want to start the first question with this question of, people are looking for a moment to compare this to. Some people are saying that this moment is a moment like 1968. Other people are asking maybe why we didn't see this kind of widespread protest movement in the wake of other police killings, like with Alton Sterling or with Walter Scott or with Mike Brown or many others, even though we did see a widespread protest movement after the killing of Michael Brown. But Dr. Carr and Professor Hansford, can you tell me, what are you seeing from this moment? What does this moment really mean? Is this really a different moment than maybe some of the ones that we've seen in our recent and distant past?
I'll defer to Dr. Carr first.
Well, first of all, thank you, Dean, for participating in this and for your ongoing work, which we're going to hear some more about in a few minutes. And thanks, Sharon, as well, and all the Howard alum. As we always say, Howard University was created for a time such as this. And we know that generally for our HBCUs, and we know that for Howard in particular. I'll keep it very brief and by way of kind of an introductory comment by saying that, you know, I think what we're seeing is what was inevitable when you have a settler state like the United States, when you have settler colonialism, period. You know, something that begins with the dispossession of land, of people from their land, and then you force Africans into that over the arc of several centuries. Ultimately, you have something that is unsustainable unless you get rid of all those people. And so what we've seen since there's been a United States of America in the late 18th century, we've seen this kind of form of general strike against the social order. And it isn't always black. I mean, you know, Donald Trump tried to evoke the Insurrection Act of 1807, but if we go back to the history of that Insurrection Act, which was passed 3 years after the Haitian Revolution, in the South, that the implications were we got to put down slave rebellions, which we also know is the origin of policing in the South. And in the North, it was a way to try to control the population that hadn't quite conformed to America's rules. They were trying to stop people trading over the Canadian border with this federal power. So at any rate, the United States has to keep itself together. The police serve a function in many ways of keeping the lower classes in order, often through the use of violence. And so what we're seeing now is the latest in a serial wave of general strikes that predate the Republic: Shays Rebellion, Bacon's Rebellion, slave rebellions after the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. We're always pushing against state violence. So finally, when you see in the 20th century, what happens is with the Great Migrations and it being a key factor in this, the police come into contact with people of African descent who enter these cities at the lowest rungs of the social order, not access to great education, housing, all the issues that are raised every time something like this happens in the wake. The Kerner Commission saying these things and so forth. So what you see is this is a general strike against the social order that's different in one general way. It's more multiracial, more intergenerational. It has been weaponized by technology, and it is overflowing the boundaries of the state to manage. So I think that in that respect, it's a little different in the sense that we may see some possibilities now that wouldn't have been present even 10 years ago, even 20 or 30 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago. And when you complicate that with a pandemic, we're in uncharted territory, Dean. That's what I think in general.
Absolutely. Professor Hansford?
Yeah, and also very, very honored to be a part of this conversation. Dean, you've done so much work leading all of us, and Doc, you've been my mentor since I was a student at Howard myself. So just happy to be talking to you about this moment, which is indeed a historic moment. I agree with everything you said, where the role of the police in our society, and there's a book called The End of Policing by Alex Vitale, which discusses this. It's you can't find it anywhere. It's not on Amazon or even on the publisher's website, but you can download it for free on the publisher's website. But he talks about this, the central role of the policing apparatus in both enslavement and in upholding the racial hierarchy, and how that intersected with upholding the economic hierarchy. And that combination of outrage at the racial oppression and the economic oppression coming to a head in a moment where there's mass unemployment, and in addition to the pandemic, you have people who are feeling the stress of seeing what happened to Ahmaud Arbery, only a couple of days later seeing what happened to George Floyd, the visceral reaction of those images, Breonna Taylor, the understanding that this can happen even if you're at home laying in your bed completely innocent, not in any way, shape, or form. Even nobody's ever deserving of any of this, but clearly in a situation where you're simply laying at home in your bed, you can be vulnerable to this if you are in the right economic and racial category. And I think people are just fed up, that people have been fed up before. As you said, Doc, 5 years ago, people were fed up in Ferguson, but it has been 5-6 years of organizing, of laying the groundwork. I think the conversations people are having in 2020 couldn't have been had in 2014. We've seen Mitt Romney out there protesting with Black Lives Matter signs, things that would have been unspeakable in 2014. I don't think they're happening only because of the video itself, because Eric Garner was video was outrageous. All of these are outrageous, but I think this the cumulative effect of the activism, of the books, of the articles, of the conversations that have been being had at the dinner table, with other people around the country, over 5 or 6 years. It's been intense, and so I think that buildup finally reached a point where it collided with an incident that allowed for that infrastructure to bear fruit. And I think that it's a moment that I'm not sure if there's been another parallel moment in history. Doc would know more, with his extensive knowledge. But I think that we are seeing the toppling of statues that have been around since Reconstruction. Things that, if we go back in our history, have not been uprooted in the same way they're being uprooted now, not through formal processes, but through people taking to the streets. And, the calls for defunding the police, I don't remember other calls of that nature happening specifically. So I think that there is a evolution that's taking place, and it's a great moment to be a part of, in the sense that it's all for us. It's all to help us live a life of liberation and freedom. And so we have a lot of hope that it's going to bear some sort of positive outcome.
Great. One of the things, I became dean at Howard's Law School on July 15th, 2014. So only weeks before Mike Brown was killed. And since that time, being in this community and seeing our response when these moments happen. So I remember at our pinning ceremony, the students taking a picture with their hands up. So hands up, don't shoot. I can't breathe. So these moments here on the Howard's campus, these moments we're always galvanized to do this work. So we're always doing this work. And that's what I remind people is we're not reactive in our work in the Howard community on police reform, criminal justice reform, and just rethinking the kind of foundational principles of the way this country was built and how it was built. We don't do that in reaction. We do it all the time, 365 days of the year. You know, this is our work here at Howard, but we do mobilize in even more intense ways in response. So, you know, over the last 2 weeks, hopefully alumni have seen the ways that we've been mobilizing. And that's what I want to talk about right now is, you know, what is the role of our Howard University community, alumni, faculty, students, staff, in the wake of these kinds of killings in a moment like this. I think for us at the law school, what we've seen is our students are engaging in Know Your Rights trainings. Professor Hansford has been leading jail support trainings. We've been leading legal observer trainings. We did a panel last week on police reform. We will have a panel upcoming that I hope alumni will join us on collective bargaining, the labor movement and police unions, which is one of the most important questions. And we set up the Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center back in 2018 as a university center to be able to address all forms of racial injustice and inequality, everything from voter suppression to educational inequity, but especially around these issues of police reform, partly because Professor Hansford was such a key part of the movement in Ferguson. So we knew that police reform work would be part of the key work of the Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center. Can both of you talk about what is kind of the work that Howard, that we as a community are doing together, the Bison community is doing together to face this moment and to make sure that meaningful reform, or even if we don't call it reform, right? If we say, okay, we're going to dismantle this entire system and rebuild something that is really something that works for our community, what is our role as a university and how can alumni help in that role?
Go ahead, Bri, because you're on the front line.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think our role is multifaceted. And of course, we all know that we come from a tradition where this is our time to step up. This is, you know, to whom much is given, much is required, especially for those of us in the law school, in the same way that our community who, you know, stepped up in terms of the healthcare workers in the hospital when COVID disproportionately began to impact the Black community because they're in charge of the health wing of our response. As lawyers, when I think about an injustice crisis, like the crisis that we're facing right now, that's our purview. That's our area to respond. Justice is where lawyers need to be on the front lines. And so we've had that. We've been at the center. We've had law students they've been willing to go out in the streets and be legal observers and be jail support people who provide resources for folks who themselves put themselves on the line and sacrificed to raise the issues that we're now talking about, which issues that we never would have talked about in a million years if nobody was willing to take those risks and put themselves in harm's way on our behalf. So we have so much thankfulness and gratefulness to them. So we also have fought in the courts. We filed lawsuits in Washington, D.C. to get the curfew lifted, and also with the New York ACLU and the Legal Aid of New York, we filed a lawsuit there as well in the Center for Constitutional Rights. In both cases, the curfews were lifted right away after we worked on those lawsuits. So there is a role for the courts to play when you're able to leverage some of the legal education that you have to fight on those fronts. And of course, on the policy level, you know, I'm working with the Mike Brown Foundation to try to push for the creation of a fund for victims of police brutality. We've been, you know, heavily engaged in trying to support policy that would be part of the solution on the local level. Our undergraduate students are organizing to work on reform in the DC City Council. We have a letter writing campaign that a student bar association has begun. We have students in Section 2 of the law school who also have been organizing testimony for an upcoming hearing in the DC City Council. So so literally, I think every area of response that you can possibly imagine, we've had Howard people at the center of it. At the center, I like to say that we try to do the work using our head, our hands, and our heart. What I mean by that is we try to engage the scholarship and the cutting edge ideas on racial justice using our heads. We get our hands dirty using litigation and lobbying, and we lead with our heart and try to follow the community and connect with people so that we're not working in isolation, but we're working as a collective in solidarity. And I think we've done all of that. I have a couple of op-eds in some publications, and we're talking to scholars about what the right solutions should be, thinking about how to make defund a reality. And we've seen things happen in Los Angeles and Minneapolis and many different cities that have been able to take those ideas around how to make change happen, not just through use of force standards and some of the reforms that we were talking about in 2014, but in a world where we don't have enough money for ventilators for everybody in this country, in a world where we don't have enough money for books for all the kids in our schools. We have money for tanks, and we have money for tear gas. We have money for all of these weapons of war to be used against American citizens. So in that warped world, it makes perfect sense to divest from the tear gas and the tanks and invest in the ventilators, invest in the schools, invest in the communities. And so I think that we're trying to find any way, shape, or form, any type of resource that we can bring to help this movement. We're trying to bring that resource, and we've been able to do so with the help of the students and the faculty and so many members of our community.
Dr. Carr?
No, I think I would encourage all alum to, as you're thinking, what can I do to support this work? What can I do with this network? Break off a few dollars and send it to Thurgood Marshall, because you understand that the investment of time, which is our most valuable resource, comes at a cost in terms of the field, just our lives. I mean, what we just heard, Professor Hansford, brother, what we just heard you lay out, this is all hands on deck, and we're in the middle of a pandemic. So please, think about that, because I know since we're all sheltered in place, more or less, folks been doing a lot of online shopping. Well, click another button, you'll get the information. Dean Holly Walker will tell you where to go. So, but it's very interesting. I was thinking as you were talking, Prof, about Charles Hamilton Houston, who came home after the so-called Great War, 1919. And he said what he had seen overseas in terms of death, what he had seen in terms of the confrontation with the ending of life, this great war, made him determined not to return to a society where that sacrifice would not be met with his ability to live to his full human potential and everyone else. And it's interesting because, the year that the war ended, of course, in that same period, Woodrow Wilson met with some Black folks in the White House who challenged him. And that delegation was led in part by a reverend named Chappelle out of North Carolina. And Dave Chappelle, in the middle of the last night, dropped 846, where he just shot fire. And I remember when he actually went down and donated some money to Allen University last year. And the point I'm trying to make is that, in this moment, Black leadership is not inherited, it's earned. Every generation must earn that leadership. So as we think about Howard, we certainly have a legacy, but that legacy is only renewed if it is earned in the living moment. So we heard Professor Hanford talk about is the kind of thing Charles Hamilton Houston was doing. And, Dean, down your way, Juneteenth, the center, down there in Texas. Think about the fact that at the George Floyd's funeral, he went to Jack Yates High School. Jack Yates was a
neighborhood.
African. Exactly right. 1872, they bought Emancipation Park in Houston. And a generation later, the Smith and Smith versus Allwright was a brother who advanced that and put this question of Black humanity in the middle of the centennial celebration in Texas. And Smith versus Allwright, later Sweat versus Painter. All these cases, they're Howard lawyers involved in that. Charles Hamilton Houston, Thurgood Marshall. I mean, so there is this momentum, and how that plays out today We've inherited that in every generation. There are alum on the call who remember Ron Walters, for example, who
Oh,
was in
yeah.
class for many years. You know, it was Howard University faculty and students who stood up what became, in many ways, a think tank for the early Congressional Black Caucus coming out of 1972 in Gary, Indiana. And that momentum then fed Black electoral politics, all these Black elected officials that came in at the state, local, and federal level. And so the momentum continued into the 80s and 90s until we get to this moment. And in this moment, we're in the middle of a pandemic. So Howard University has helped form the Black Coalition Against COVID. If y'all go to blackcoalitionagainstcovid.org, you can see all the things that are being done. In fact, there is a collaboration day after tomorrow, actually, 11 to noon, WHUT, WHUR, and WPFW, the Pacific station here in Washington, are doing a ritual of remembrance for those who have made transitions. Some alum, of course, y'all know Dr. Alice Galati, who was a real fixture on this campus, who intervened during the AIDS crisis in DC and in the country and in the world. So that's one thing that Howard is doing. And you've heard Professor Hansford lay out all of this policy work that's being done. Dean, it's interesting because, yes, I remember that photograph when you first came and the students did hands up, don't shoot. It's important, some Howard alum on this call probably remember that 2 years earlier than that, your immediate predecessor, Dean Schmoke, Kurt Schmoke, he called us together and said, look, I just got off the phone with this brother in Florida, Broward County, named Benjamin Crump. And, you know, there's going to be a need. Howard students and faculty intervened in the Trayvon Martin immediately. What can we do?
They called for Zimmerman to be prosecuted. And that was it was a Howard student who really led the movement in that.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Dean. That's exactly right. So in this moment, we have our policy work going on. There's a interdisciplinary work group coming out of the graduate school. I'm a member of that group. Terry Adams out of sociology has kind of brought us together. There's a Howard University poll in the field now. We've had a couple of webinars on it. We're continuing to meet to generate public opinion in terms of, you know, what's going on, how are Black people not only looking at this pandemic, but now looking at this new resistance to state violence in the country and in the world. And I'll end with this. You know, it's interesting. This may be where this moment is different. George Floyd is a regular Black dude in the street. The whole question of respectability politics seems to have been eroded. At this moment, you're looking at a movement, as I say, it's not only intergenerational, interracial, in places like Minneapolis that is 60% white, but it's also interclass. And for us, the HBCUs, Howard in particular, has to be able to have a Black-facing conversation that's inclusive, and we're demonstrating that now. And then as we face outward, bring the full momentum of our whole community, because we're not engaging now in trying to put what we can imagine to be our most representative people or our best foot forward. No. It's either all of us or it's none of us, because this society cannot continue to sustain itself with this idea that if a few of us get in, then that represents everyone. And I think that's the kind of work we've heard Professor Hansford just lay out that Howard is engaged in. It's going to lead to the transformation, not only of life for our people in terms of people of African descent, but it's really going to help lead to transformation in this society and hopefully the world if we continue along this path.
Absolutely. That was very powerful. I think that drawing of that line of history from Charles Hamilton Houston all the way to this moment. I think it is one of the things, as you said, that we have legacy, but you must earn that legacy. You must earn that place of leadership every day, every week, every year. It is not something that we just inherit and keep, but we earn it. I also want to point
because you might be getting ready to say it, but I want to ask you, because part of it is when we do face outward, Anna Julia Cooper said it best many years ago, right? When and where I enter, the race enters with me. I hope you'll talk a little bit about the Anti-Racist Clearinghouse Project, because when they see you, they see us. And alum need to understand that you don't walk alone in the world when you engage in these larger valences. So I didn't want to interrupt you, but I wanted to mention.
No, I'm glad you brought that up. I almost forgot. So I've been working in the National Law Dean community, in the community of leadership among law schools, to really, make sure that all law schools and universities, when you see statements from university presidents and from deans of schools saying we are, disturbed, are upset by what happened to George Floyd. What we're asking for is for people to audit their own universities, to audit their own law schools, to audit their own departments, and ask themselves, what are your hiring practices? What do your student bodies look like? And so with the leadership of a few other deans, Dean Danielle Conway, Dean Carla Pratt, who are both Howard Law graduates, I'm proud to say, Kim Mutcherson from Rutgers, and Angela Onawachi-Willig, we curated a site called the Anti-Racist Clearinghouse Project. I encourage you to go to the AALS.com website, American Association of Law Schools. You can find it there, where we put together reading lists, music, audit questions for universities and for law schools to ask themselves, all to really cause a true reckoning, right? To not just use this moment to put out statements, but what we want people to do is to use this moment to ask yourself, are you truly committed to racial justice? If you are a university committed to racial justice, here are the questions you need to ask yourself and then answer them. And if they're the wrong answers, you need to show that internally you're committed, because it's impossible to be committed to the cause of racial justice if your house is wrong. And I think a lot of people have been asking those questions in their workplaces. I'm sure we have a lot of alumni on this call who are in their own workplaces. They see their corporations issuing statements and they're saying, oh, but there's a lot wrong inside our own corporation. Why are we issuing statements on something we don't even do in-house? And I think this movement is causing those kinds of questions, and we want to push those questions forward. So I can't tell you how proud I am of the graduates of Howard University School of Law who are now law deans around the country who are pushing this question. And so I'm really, I'm following them in their leadership that they are really providing. But you're right, when Howard shows up in the room, people tend to sit up and listen and ask, what is really the agenda for this movement? I also want to commend the work of the School of Communications that did an incredible panel on the treatment of journalists and the role of journalism during these protests, and also the School of Education that's been putting together panels. And this is a question that probably a lot of alumni have about, how do you talk to your children about police brutality, about police violence, and about the protest? And we see a lot of our kids leading the way. I've heard from alumni all over the country. They are out in the streets, but they are out there because their 12-year-olds and 13-year-olds were doing signs. Their children were going to the protest. The only question was, were the parents going with them? But the children were going. And so I think that is another thing that we've seen that's similar to other times of protest movements, is the children are leading us. The young people really are leading us. So I want to turn to some alumni questions that were submitted. The first question that we got was, can you explain why it is being said that convicting a police officer is extremely difficult? And can you suggest the pathway to change this in the legal system? What policy changes need to be instituted to make it easier to convict police officers in these kinds of situations? I think particularly, and I want to say her name, Breonna Taylor, of those officers who have not even been arrested. So we are not near victory in the George Floyd case because they've only been arrested, the 4 officers, and one of them actually got out on bail that was raised through a GoFundMe. And in Breonna Taylor's case, those officers have not been arrested. They're passing policy and law changes in a case to react to a case in which the officers haven't even been arrested yet. So Professor Hansford, Dr. Carr, do you want to speak to that question of why is it so hard to convict police officers, and what are the policy changes that are needed to address that issue?
Go ahead, Brian.
Sure. The problem with the criminal justice system as it works in regards to police is that it's rigged from the start. The prosecutors, and you see this with the Breonna Taylor case, the prosecutors are hesitant to even go down the trail of starting with an arrest, which, that people seem to get arrested over jaywalking. There's a video on the internet last night of some 13-year-old Black children who were arrested and handcuffed for jaywalking. People get arrested every day, especially Black people, for minimal things. But when it comes to police officers, even the arrest seems like something that people need to march in the streets to get, because prosecutors are, from a structural perspective, depend on police to do their jobs. They depend on police to bring them people that they can prosecute, and they have a very tight relationship with police. Secondly, there is another structural problem. There's an issue in the law when it comes to use of force and what standards we allow. There are Supreme Court cases. Graham versus Connor is one that we've talked about in the past, that say that police have this wide discretion when it comes to using force, even for the smallest infractions. So not only are the prosecutors not inclined as a matter of their own disposition to bring those charges, but also as a matter of the law, they find themselves in an environment where there's such a high standard that needs to be met that in many cases, under the law, the police have this discretion. So those are multiple levels. We also have police unions that have created different levels of protections that make it very difficult to hold police accountable. They have a certain number of hours, depends on the jurisdiction, 48, 72 hours, sometimes more, to get their stories together and have a lawyer to consult with before they even have to talk to investigators. They have police unions who are willing to raise funds to help their defense. So again, there are these institutional structural impediments to accountability on the criminal side that makes it very difficult to hold police accountable. And then people have also been talking about how on the civil side, when it comes to suing for damages, it's also near impossible to get a financial penalty implemented that comes out of police officers' pockets that might serve as a deterrent to this activity. Most of them are indemnified by the city. So even if in the rare case that someone is found liable for one of these killings, Breonna Taylor or George Floyd or any other one, the money wouldn't come from the police officer's pocket anyway. So it's less of a deterrent than it might be if you or I were sued. And then there's the doctrine of qualified immunity, which makes it very difficult. There has to be a clearly established pattern of particular action being something that violates the law before you can get liability. So there are multiple structural levels of impediments to accountability for police that have created the situation where they really feel like they have a license to kill. And in all honesty, they probably do it, and that's why the people had to go take to the streets to try to get answers here, because there are very few options left. You have the civil side closed, you have the criminal side closed. What options are left? And people are looking to the defund option as one that is perhaps most right at our fingertips, because local city councils do have the ability to change budgets in the short term, as we've seen over the last couple of days, so other things.
Yeah, we have a particular question on that. So I definitely want to come back specifically to the quote, defund the police kind of movement that we're seeing kind of get some momentum, even though it's been around for a long time. Kind of the idea of abolishing the police or defunding the police has been around for a long time. We have a question on that I'll follow up with in a second. Dr. Carr, did you want to speak to this issue of the kind of legal barriers to criminal prosecution and also police accountability in general?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think, Professor Hansford has laid it out quite well. I would just pick up just a little bit on the question of qualified immunity again to understand that that's, in many ways, it's judge-made law. Right. And there are several cases, maybe I think there are 8, that involve some form of qualified immunity that are winding their way through the courts, and the Supreme Court has to decide whether or not they're going to hear them. And it's interesting to see that it doesn't line up the way we usually see it in commercial news entertainment media. When you think about 5-4 splits on the Supreme Court, you got Sonia Sotomayor, course, no stranger to Howard Law, has been there several times to talk. In fact, I want to say maybe the first law school she visited after she was sworn in was Howard. I remember that day she came in. She was
Yeah.
so late because she stopped and took pictures with all the people who work in the cafeteria.
Everyone said, "Where are my people?" And everyone came out. She took pictures with every single staff person who wanted to take a picture with her.
No question about it. And it was a beautiful thing. But, you know, on that day, she talked about statutory interpretation, and she talked about judge-made law, and she talked about the importance of having graduates who fill every position in the legal pipeline. That includes prosecutors. It's very important to understand this. But, you know, you have her questioning the doctrine of qualified immunity, and then you have Clarence Thomas.
Right.
Clarence Thomas, but if we know Thomas's jurisprudence, we know that that's consistent with his assessment that if it isn't in the statute, don't go beyond the statute, and this is just made up by judges. But if you can get to the point where judges determine that, you know, if there is no clear standard in terms of use of force, we shouldn't be making one up to replace them. You know, there's a possibility that qualified immunity can be displaced. And there's one other thing I'd add. You know, it's interesting. We look at the Laquan McDonald case in Chicago. We look at the millions of dollars in settlements in municipalities. We have to understand that how ironic is this? Victims of state violence, victims of police violence, who do quote unquote successfully, because I think the whole notion of justice for is something we should rethink, because, you know, I guess, I don't know, Professor Hanson, it might've been Leslie McSpadden I heard say this first, you know, or maybe it was, maybe when she came, it was Sabrina Fulton, first time she came to campus, you know, justice would be my son restored to me. Justice with Sandra Bland's sister, when she came over to Howard and talked about, justice would be my sister being alive. So I don't like this justice for, you know, notion, but at least some form of restitution on the civil side when the families settle with a city or settle with a municipality. Where does that money come from? That money comes from it's balanced on the backs of the very people who are the victims of state terror. These bonds that cities float to get the money to pay end up coming out of end up being distributed for settlements, and they then go and raise taxes, or they create new ways to siphon more resources. And, you know, Professor Hanson, you could talk about this, because you were in the streets in Ferguson. It'd be very interesting. I'd love to hear what you have to say about this sister being elected the first Black mayor of Ferguson, because we know that state terror was literally being subsidized by the victims of state terror. And I think that's something that we really have to get at in terms of defunding police. As I say, you know, like you said, we're going to talk about that. It's also something that we need to take into consideration when we think about breaking this chain of allowing police to engage in reigns of terror with no check on them. And I think that's why one of the things we've seen in this bill that's hopefully going to wind its way through Congress, we'll see what Mitch McConnell does. Looks like he's deputized Tim Scott to be the conscience of the GOP. We'll see how that works. In fact, that is literally what they were calling him. I hope Senator Scott can bear up under that weight. But part of the policy changes they're calling for is, you know, not only getting rid of no-knock warrants, not only these other elements, but also trying to strip this shield of immunity from police officers so that, you know, they can be held accountable, because ultimately the police are not a separate division of our society. They're human beings too, and nobody should be above law, particularly those who are in charge with enforcing the law.
Absolutely. I hope everyone will look at the Justice in Policing Act that our alumna, Howard University alumna, Senator Kamala Harris, had a huge part in, and those are some of the calls, which is one of them is to abolish qualified immunity, of course, get rid of no-knock warrants. So a number of, you know, and sometimes I think one of the frustrations, and I'll move to this defunding the police issue, I think some of the frustrations, I posted the 8 Can't Wait campaign, which became very controversial because people were saying, well, it's not data driven, or it's partially data driven, and also it's only nibbling around the edges. I have a tendency to think of these things as both and.
Yes.
That we need to do the small policy reforms or the things that reform what we have now. So looking at things like, there should be nowhere in our country where chokeholds are allowed, but we also know that chokeholds have been outlawed in many, many jurisdictions, and they're still being used. We should get rid of no-knock warrants, but we know even if we outlaw no-knock warrants, police will still engage in that kind of conduct. So I understand the frustration with this notion that we have these reforms that are so tiny and seem so obvious and really should never have existed, that there is a frustration there. I want to give voice to some of that frustration on the other side about the defunding the police issue. And this is something, especially I think it's a generational divide. And we do have to confront the generational divide in this movement. Kind of what do people think is appropriate? I have to say a lot of the ideas that our students have, are things that, 10 years ago, I would have said, oh, we could never do that. That you're not making sense. We can't do some of these things. So I want to give you a question from a member of the class of 1968, and I'm going to give you the exact quote. So this is her question, and I want to quote from her question. So this is not my question. This is an alum, class of 1968, but I think it's important to phrase it in the way that she did, because I think it shows some of what we're dealing with on this question of what should we do about the problem of police reform. So our alum says, quote, "Will you please help our young people to understand that we cannot defund the police? That is the kind of ignorant response they, in quotes, expect us to put forth as Black people. There are a few rogue cops in every city, just as there are a few people of color committing the crimes of which all of us have to bear the brunt. We cannot lump all cops in the same offensive category, just as, quote, they cannot lump all people of color in the same group." So that's her question. Will you please explain to the young people that we cannot defund the police? Professor Hansford, what would you say? And I've heard this from a lot of people saying, aren't we hurting our cause, even if we believe in what's underneath that principle, by using the phrase defund the police as something that is so unappetizing to so many people? Won't it just turn people off, and we should stop saying defund the police? What do you think about that?
Well, yeah, I'll answer, but I'm looking forward to hearing Dr. Carr's response to this, because I do think when I think about this controversy, I think about in the past when we were fighting for desegregation or even abolition, there was this knee-jerk reaction of feeling that people may be making asks that are too extreme. Some people envisioned desegregation to be something where, immediately overnight, all institutions would be desegregated, and people had the specter of social integration to be afraid of, and people were talking about they were visualizing a worst case scenario, and I think, as opposed to having the discussions in terms of what is possible and what is necessary. And I think for this situation, like I said a little bit earlier, I think that the defund the police phrase is a huge improvement. If you think back to 2014, many people in prominent places were saying they don't have any plan, they don't have any agenda. What are they calling for? Now at least we have an agenda, and it's much more clear, and people have responded right away. I'll go far as to say much more clear than some of the technical reforms that the lawyers and the scholars are calling for. It takes a long time to explain to someone who's not an attorney what qualified immunity is about, or some of these other standards that we're trying to ask for. And it's much easier for people to conceptualize changing in the budgetary decisions of a city council. So I think that it's a huge improvement in terms of where we were 6 years ago, and I credit the activists for improving that messaging. And I do think, again, that the defund versus the 8 can't wait debate then there's a new response called 8 to abolition, which is another articulation of the possibility of some of these rearrangements in the way that we are allocating our resources as a society. But one thing I do have to disagree with is this idea that it's a bad apple problem and not a problem that is one that can be addressed through structures. I think that the problem is that the structures are set up in such a way that this crisis will always happen again and again. It's always happened. You know, Dr. Carr taught me that. It's been 400. It's been happening for 400 years, and you know, it hasn't been, you know, it's particularly bad. You know, sheriffs in the South that were the problem. You know, it wasn't particularly bad overseers that just went too far in their discipline. You know, it was the structures themselves that we had to question, and we had to come to grips with the possibility that better structures were possible. Another world is possible, and enlarging our imagination. When people are calling for defund, I think you have to realize they are envisioning replacement structures. They are envisioning mental health practitioners responding to mental health crises as opposed to police with guns. They are envisioning other ways to deal with people who are homeless, and for example, giving them access to housing as opposed to enforcing, loitering or laws against sleeping in public that put them in contact with the police. They are envisioning different ways of responding to the war on drugs, which we've seen with the opioid crisis. There are ways to respond to that besides policing. And so in each of these situations, the call is a call for a reimagining and a replacement as opposed to an abandoning of the idea of creating safety in our communities. It's about finding new ways to create safety in our communities, and it's calls for imagination. And I hope that it's not going to be seen as a generational divide, because we do have scholars who are articulating these points and thinking hard about them and helping us to flesh out proposals. And we need that. We need people with expertise to be able to tell us exactly how to go forward. So I want to reach out and say that we have to bridge the generational divide if we're going to get to a solution here.
I have to say, the first person I ever heard give a talk on abolishing the police was Angela Davis.
Exactly.
In law school, she came and gave when I tell you she burned down the house at Harvard Law School talking about abolishing the police and prisons.
Yes.
And this was 20 plus years ago. So this, in that sense, is, and I think sometimes it's one of the things I can't stand is we're not our ancestors, right? And because a lot of these ideas that are being claimed and brought forth and run with these ideas have been around for a long time, and they actually are things that are well established among scholars who have been advocating for many of these measures for 25, 30, 40, 50, 100 years. So, I think we also need to be in conversation about the idea that you believe is a Generation Z idea or a millennials idea is actually an idea that's been around for a long time. So let's bridge that divide in that way. Dr. Carr?
Continuing along that line and with that momentum, safety, the idea of public safety is really at the heart of it. And Dean, to your point, I hope that we can do in our time what our ancestors did in theirs. Right. Because this confrontation with state terror, with state violence, has been going on since we were brought into the field of violence. And so, a Howard undergrad who went to Vanderbilt Law School, Brandon Harris, lawyer down in Tennessee, he said something the other day. He said, if you have a couple of bad apples in an apple pie, you got to throw the pie away. So so the justice point, this thing is baked into the structure of the society. So, ancient Egyptians have a phrase that translates roughly "my heart of different ages." When we start thinking about intergenerational stuff, people sometimes forget that they were young ones too. And so if we think about the fact that in 1968, the DC police force was 75% white men, and that when Dr. King was killed and the places went up in smoke, you had young people, a lot of them from Howard, Nonviolent Action Group. I'm thinking about Stokely Carmichael, Charlie Cobb, and those cats, Karen Spellman, and that crew. They were in the street demanding structural change. And part of it was get some police officers that look like us. And what you saw with the Walter Washington administration and then subsequent era up through Marion Barry and forward, as the police force changed, it didn't eliminate terror, it didn't eliminate state violence, but it did change the nature of the interaction between law enforcement and the community when people who were on the police force began coming from out of the community. So as Professor Hansford has walked us through, we start talking about public safety. The first question we got to ask ourselves is, when was there a public? The United States has never had a common sense of our common humanity. Otherwise, the idea of safety wouldn't be a conversation, because you don't see folks running up into white suburban communities and pulling a gun out and wait a minute, are you all right, ma'am? Are you all right, miss? Because I see a human being. But if the police are called into a community where somebody is off their medication or is animated because they don't have a place to stay and they came here because maybe I can spend the night on your couch, and you pull out your gun first, no, you know what? Take some money away from the police budget and have a social worker respond at the same time. Can we ramp up the EMTs? Can we get some other people with wraparound supports? Of course, our School of Social Work at Howard. All you got to do is talk to Sandra Crew, Dean Crew. We have an army of social workers. Can we employ some more? And since you already getting $100 million, can we slice off 10 of it and put over here in some of these wraparound services? And guess who would also be relieved? The police.
Yes.
Because the police are not social workers. And you have women and men out there in the force who are the good apples, so to speak, in a bad pie, who are saying, I don't want to have to try to de-escalate something if I don't even have that training. And you're asking me to do this on top of everything else. And I'm trying to be in the squad room telling people you shouldn't be pulling this way, but you don't even know anything about my people to begin with. So that's what it's operating in. Only other thing I'd say is, I know we're kind of wrapping up here. In 1968, there was a brother named James Foreman. It's funny, I was reading the other day, I got it over here. And
Book.
I don't know if y'all ever read this book, The Making of Black Revolutionaries. This is James Foreman, who was with SNCC and Stokely Carmichael, and I was rereading some stuff about him and Stokely's relationship. But his son, James Foreman Jr., wrote a book called Locking Up Our Own. There is a class tension in this conversation that we have to confront. We start talking about our cousins and them. Sometimes, according to James Foreman Jr., some people in our community look at other people in our community like, well, maybe they should have called the police on you. I'm kind of scared about, until we confront the fact that no human being, which is what Dave Chappelle was saying in his thing. I don't care what George Floyd did. I don't care. I don't know. Why does Breonna Taylor have to be a model citizen? No, right. You're a human being. You don't deserve to die. Until we get that through our minds, and remember that in 1968, we were 20 years old or 19 years old and in the street. We have to understand that our young people are who we were at that point, and we all want the same thing. We have to work together. So I'll stop with that.
Yeah, and I really encourage us to think about the interactions, how we as citizens interact with the police. Yes. Because there are so many interactions that don't need to occur. So when we talk about reimagine, I love that word, Professor Hansford, because we do need to reimagine justice, and we need to reimagine what does it mean to have a group of armed people who we pay to, quote, enforce public safety. And in many situations, these are not situations in which we never, ever need to interact. I think about Eric Garner all the time. Why do we prevent people from selling loose cigarettes? We do that so that we can tax packets of cigarettes. So that's a tax policy issue, a tax enforcement issue. Why would you ever ask the police to get involved in what is essentially a tax dispute? Send him, if you see him selling a loose cigarette, send him a citation in the mail that says you're in violation of the New York tax law. Or in the case of, Mr. Floyd, if you think that he passed a bad check or a bad bill to someone, why don't you have the store just write out the complaint? You send it to the police department and they send him a citation. But I think we as in this country just have to ask ourselves why we have accepted all this time and why we aren't questioning that foundation. And I think that's a lot of what we're seeing happen now. I think as the African-American community, we've been doing that for a long time, right? As the Black community. But I think you're seeing other people begin to question, why do we call the police, do we call a police officer if we see someone on our streets who are unhomed, someone's unhomed, and we call the police for that? That is, all of these things are things that should not have happened, shouldn't be happening now. And that's what people are saying when they say, let's redirect resources to social workers, to teachers, to drug counselors, to whole groups of civilians who help enforce various laws. That cuts the footprint of the police. So if we think about reducing the footprint of the police, traffic interactions, we have technology. As we all know who live in the DMV and other areas where traffic cameras catch you, why should a police officer ever pull you over for speeding? There's really no reason, or for a broken tail light or any of those things. We can reimagine what a society looks like where it is highly unusual that you would ever confront an armed law enforcement officer. And that is something that we really need to think about and question. And I know both of you have been doing that for so long, but I think these are ideas that are coming, to the forefront. I want to give you both a chance to make some closing remarks, but I want to just, everyone saw what happened in Georgia this week in terms of voting. We know that people who protest are people who vote, right? These are people who are involved in their civic life. We know that we are all engaged in both processes at the same time. We are out protesting and we are also voting. They are not those are not mutually exclusive. And so often people are saying, go out and vote. If you're out protesting, go out and vote. But I get the feeling that those are the same people. The same people that are willing to take time out of their day and go protest are the same people who will take time out of their day and stand in line for 6 hours to go vote. But we know we have big elections coming up. I hope everyone is registered and that you all vote. And also be safe. If you're out protesting, we know that COVID-19 hasn't gone anywhere. Please make sure that you're social distancing, you wear your mask. There are testing regimes that have been stood up all around the country. Here in DC, we have the Benning site down in Southeast that the university is set up for free testing, but I really encourage us all to stay safe since the COVID-19 crisis has had such a disproportionate impact on our community. Those are my closing words from Professor Hansford and Dr. Carr.
Well, I would just say I'm so proud of our community, our students, our staff, our faculty, and our alumni for being a part of this moment. Dr. Carr taught me for most of the history of the United States, law enforcement meant implementing laws that were explicitly designed to subjugate Black people. And that's why this movement now is saying that we need a new vision, we deserve a better vision, and they're putting their energy and commitment behind creating a world where all of us can feel safe, including Black people. And I'm just so happy that this moment has taken place. I was telling a friend earlier who was asking me, am I upset in this moment, or am I particularly stressed? And I was telling them the stressful thing, the upsetting thing would be if people sat and watched that video of what happened to Ahmaud Arbery or to George Floyd and they weren't in the streets. That would be something that would have me stressed and upset. But the fact that this happened and this is happening in the way that it did, 50 states, countries around the world, and people willing to go and put themselves at risk, go out and protest after curfew, face jail, face tear gas, to do it all for us, to make sure that, we can have a possibility of another world where we can feel like we are full citizens. That's something that I'm just happy to be here to live through that moment. And, I'm happy that Howard University is at the front and they're fighting on it. We're fighting on it.
Not they, you, brother. Support,
We.
support the law school, support Thurgood Marshall. If you want to know what it looks like, you listening to it with Justin Hansford. Because what's going on in the street now, this is how social strikes against the order work generally. You have the spontaneity with the flashpoint. We've seen that before. But slowly what emerges is those who have been organizing and thinking about this before. That's why Justin Hansford, who was in the streets in Ferguson, is able to emerge now and say, here are the policy recommendations through orientation. And now our politicians must act. Whether it's Keisha Lance Bottoms saying, fire these police in Atlanta, whether it's people like Kamala Harris or others in the Congress saying, here's the legislation. And then finally, judges are appointed by presidents at the federal level. If you don't understand anything other than that, please make sure you are registered, make sure you know where your precinct is. And I don't care if we have to stand in line 1,000,000 hours. Why? Because when we win, we're going to reform that too. Make sure that we vote, because if we do not, that's not going to mean the issue is going away. It may come to a head even quicker. And no amount of Confederate monuments being thrown in a way like it's some kind of levee to stop this flood is going to stop that. So let's try to intervene as we can. It's great to be with everybody. Thank you, Dean.
Thank you.
I'm just so pleased to be with both of you and the amazing work that you do on behalf of Howard University and just the commitment to our students. I mean, we are looking at two of the most committed faculty in this university. That's one of the things I love. There's so many things I love about Howard, but I think the commitment of our faculty to the students and to making sure that our students get a full educational experience, not just in the classroom, but in the streets, if necessary. when we have moments like this and so many, and in the courtrooms and testifying before the DC City Council, we do not believe that education exists just in the classroom, but it is all around us. It is everywhere. I really encourage everyone who's able on this alumni call, please give to Howard University. You know, look at the work of the Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center. It is on the law school website. You can designate gifts to the Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center when you go on to give on the howard.edu site. You see the giving button right there. Press it. Designate for Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center. And we just really want to have the resources to do this work at a high level, to litigate, to do 2 litigations last week, to do all of these trainings, all of those things take a tremendous amount of resources. And we're arming the next generation of civil rights and human rights lawyers. And to do that, you know, they definitely need your support and, you know, the resources that alumni bring to the table. We are so grateful to you for spending this hour with us. We look forward to engaging with you. As Sharon said, this is part of an entire series where the university, under the strategic plan Howard Forward, where we talk about disseminating and generating research and scholarship that is at the heart of that is really at the heart of what our communities are most concerned about. That is part of what we're here to do. And so they will be doing this in an alumni series. I hope you will come back to join us. And I hope you'll join us at the law school for the collective bargaining and police union panel that we'll put on, and the ed school for the talks on talking to your children about police brutality and about the protest. Thank you so much for being here, and I just really celebrate you and celebrate the Howard alumni community. Have a great afternoon.
Stay safe.